Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of man who believed in facts, science, and the predictable nature of Earth's creatures. As a wildlife researcher working in the remote forests of northern Canada, he spent his days cataloging animal behaviors, tracking migration patterns, and maintaining the delicate balance between human civilization and nature. His small research station sat nestled among towering pines, 40 miles from the nearest town, where the only sounds were wind through branches and the occasional call of local wildlife. The night everything changed started like any other. Marcus was updating his field notes by lamplight when a brilliant flash illuminated the forest outside his cabin. The light was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not the harsh white of lightning or the warm glow of fire, but something that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly blue-green energy. The flash lasted only seconds, but it left strange shadows burned into his vision and an odd humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Initially, Marcus assumed it was some kind of military aircraft or perhaps a meteorite. Living this far from civilization meant witnessing unusual atmospheric phenomena was not uncommon. He made a quick note in his journal about the time and intensity of the light, then tried to return to his work. However, the humming sound persisted, growing stronger rather than fading away. It seemed to be coming from the northwest, roughly 2 miles through dense forest toward the old ravine where he sometimes collected water samples. Sleep proved impossible that night. The humming continued until dawn, accompanied by strange animal calls that Marcus couldn't identify despite his extensive knowledge of local species. These weren't the howls of wolves or the screams of mountain lions, but something entirely different, almost musical in quality, yet unsettling in a way that made his skin crawl. When morning finally arrived, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Marcus decided to investigate. He packed his standard field equipment, camera, sample containers, GPS device, and emergency supplies. The trek to the ravine normally took about an hour, but as he moved through the forest, he noticed disturbing changes. Trees showed scorch marks in perfect spirals around their trunks. The ground in certain areas was completely devoid of vegetation, forming circular patterns that stretched 15 feet across. Most unnervingly, there were no signs of the small animals that typically inhabited this region. No squirrels chattering in the trees, no birds singing, not even insects buzzing around. When Marcus reached the ravine, he found something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. A massive object, roughly the size of a school bus, sat partially embedded in the rocky slope. Its surface appeared to be made of some kind of metal that shifted color depending on the viewing angle, cycling through deep purples, blues, and greens. The craft, for that's clearly what it was, had sustained significant damage. Large sections of its hull were cracked open, revealing a dark interior that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Marcus approached cautiously, his scientific training warring with an instinctive fear. This was clearly not human technology. The craftsmanship was too advanced, the materials too exotic. As he circled the object, documenting it with his camera, he discovered several openings in the hull where pieces had broken away during impact. Through these gaps, he could see the interior was filled with strange, organic-looking structures that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence. The smell was the first thing that hit him when he finally worked up the courage to look inside one of the larger openings. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but completely alien, like ozone mixed with something floral and a metallic undertone that made his sinuses burn. The interior space was larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, as if the craft operated on some kind of spatial distortion technology. Curved walls were lined with what appeared to be control surfaces, though they resembled living tissue more than mechanical components. In the center of the main chamber, Marcus discovered 3 large, pod-like structures. Each was about the size of a refrigerator and appeared to be made of the same color-shifting material as the craft's exterior. 2 of the pods had been severely damaged in the crash, their contents spilled across the chamber floor in a mess of crystalline fragments, and viscous fluid. But the third pod remained intact, its surface pulsing with a steady rhythm like a massive heartbeat. As Marcus leaned in for a closer examination, the intact pod suddenly split open with a soft hissing sound. Inside, suspended in a web of silvery filaments, were three creatures unlike anything in Earth's fossil record or modern taxonomy. They were roughly the size of house cats, but bore no resemblance to any terrestrial animal. Their bodies were elongated and serpentine, covered in scales that reflected light like prisms. Each creature had 4 limbs that ended in delicate, almost hand-like appendages, and their heads were proportionally large with enormous eyes that seemed to hold an unsettling intelligence. The creatures were clearly young, possibly newborns, and appear to be in some kind of hibernation or suspended animation. Their breathing was shallow, but steady, and their scales shifted through subtle color changes as if responding to dreams. Marcus realized he was looking at alien life forms, actual extraterrestrial beings that had somehow ended up crashed in the Canadian wilderness. His first instinct was to contact the authorities, but he hesitated. What would happen to these creatures if the government got involved? They would likely be taken to some sterile laboratory, studied, experimented on, possibly dissected. As a man who had dedicated his life to understanding and protecting animal life, the thought filled him with revulsion. But these weren't Earth animals. They were aliens, representatives of a species that had somehow traveled across the cosmos only to crash land in his research area. Marcus found himself torn between scientific fascination and a growing sense of responsibility. These creatures were helpless, orphaned, and completely dependent on whatever mercy they might receive from the first human to discover them. As he stood there debating his options, one of the creatures began to stir. Its large eyes opened slowly, revealing irises that swirled with the same color-shifting property as their scales. When it saw Marcus, it didn't show fear or aggression. Instead, it made a soft, musical sound that seemed almost questioning. The other 2 creatures began to wake as well, their movements weak but coordinated, as if they were naturally inclined to stay together. Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of reporting the crash site, he would take the creatures back to his research station. He told himself it was for their protection, that he needed to study them to understand their needs before determining the best course of action. But deep down, he knew the truth was more complex. These beings represented the discovery of the century, and he wasn't ready to hand them over to people who might not have their best interests at heart. Getting the creatures back to his cabin proved challenging. They were weak from their ordeal and seemed unable to walk properly in Earth's gravity. Marcus improvised a carrying container from his emergency supplies and carefully transported them one at a time. They didn't resist his handling, though they made soft chirping sounds that seemed to indicate communication between them. Back at his research station, Marcus set up a temporary habitat in his spare room using heated lamps, water containers, and soft bedding materials. The creatures huddled together in a corner, their scales flickering through nervous color patterns. They watched Marcus with those unervingly intelligent eyes, as if trying to understand his intentions. That first night, Marcus barely slept. He found himself checking on the creatures every hour, monitoring their breathing and taking notes on their behavior. They seemed to sleep in shifts, with one always remaining partially alert while the other 2 rested. Their scales would dim to deeper colors during sleep cycles, then brighten when they were active. By morning, Marcus had made another disturbing discovery. The creatures weren't just intelligent. They seemed to be learning at an accelerated rate. When he entered their room, they immediately oriented toward him and made specific sound patterns that appeared to be attempts at mimicking human speech. Their large eyes tracked his movements with obvious understanding, and they showed clear preferences for certain foods when he offered them various options. As the days passed, Marcus became increasingly fascinated by his unexpected guests. He began to think of them as individuals rather than specimens, noting their distinct personalities and behaviors. The largest of the 3, which he privately named Alpha, seemed to be naturally curious and bold. It would approach Marcus first when he entered the room and showed interest in his research equipment. The second creature, Beta, was more cautious but displayed remarkable problem-solving abilities, figuring out how to manipulate simple latches and containers. The smallest, Gamma, was the most social, constantly seeking physical contact with its companions and making the most complex vocalizations. However, Marcus also began experiencing strange effects from his prolonged exposure to the creatures. His dreams became vivid and bizarre, filled with images of alien landscapes and impossible geometries. He found himself understanding concepts that he couldn't quite articulate in human language. Most disturbing of all, he began to feel a growing resentment toward Earth's native wildlife. The change was subtle at first. When a family of raccoons raided his garbage, instead of his usual amused tolerance, Marcus felt genuine anger. Their simple, predictable behaviors seemed primitive and irritating compared to the complex intelligence he witnessed in his alien charges. When a hawk killed a rabbit near his cabin, he found himself shouting at the natural predator as if it had committed some kind of moral transgression. These feelings intensified as the creatures continued to develop. Within a week, they were walking steadily and showing remarkable coordination. They began to manipulate objects with their hand-like appendages, creating simple tools and even artistic arrangements of stones and sticks. Their vocalizations became more sophisticated, incorporating sounds that seemed designed to communicate specific concepts rather than just emotions. Marcus realized that his three charges were not just intelligent. They were potentially more advanced than humans in certain cognitive areas. They learned new skills at an incredible pace, displayed creative thinking that surprised him daily, and showed emotional depth that made them seem almost human at times. In contrast, the familiar animals around his research station began to seem like biological automatons, following simple programming without real consciousness or creativity. The breaking point came during the second week. Marcus was observing the creatures as they collaborated on building a complex structure from various materials he had provided. Their teamwork was flawless, their innovation remarkable. They seemed to be creating something that served both practical and aesthetic purposes, a combination of shelter and art that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. At that moment, a mouse scurried across the floor of the room. The creatures immediately focused on it with predatory interest, but they didn't attack. Instead, they seemed to be studying it with the same scientific curiosity that Marcus might show toward a new species. The mouse, oblivious to the attention, simply continued its random searching for food crumbs. The contrast was overwhelming. Here were three beings who had traveled across space, survived a devastating crash, and were now rebuilding their lives with intelligence and grace. And there was a mouse, operating on pure instinct, capable of nothing more than basic survival behaviors. For the first time in his career as a wildlife researcher, Marcus felt contempt for a natural animal. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus walked outside and found himself surrounded by the sounds of the forest he had once loved. Owls hooting their repetitive calls, insects buzzing in mindless patterns, small mammals scurrying through underbrush without purpose beyond immediate survival. For the first time, these sounds didn't bring him peace. Instead, they seemed like a cacophony of meaningless noise produced by creatures too primitive to understand their own existence. Standing in the darkness, Marcus realized that his encounter with the alien hatchlings had fundamentally changed his perspective on life itself. These beings represented evolution taken to a higher level, intelligence refined beyond anything Earth had produced. In comparison, every animal around him seemed like a failed experiment in consciousness, a dead end in the development of true awareness. The thought should have disturbed him, but instead, it felt like an awakening. For the first time, Marcus understood that intelligence and consciousness weren't just differences of degree. They were fundamental divisions between types of life. His three alien charges belonged to a category of existence that transcended the simple biological imperatives that drove terrestrial animals. As dawn approached, Marcus made a decision that would define his relationship with the natural world for months to come. He would dedicate himself completely to understanding and caring for these superior beings. Every other form of life, every native animal that shared this forest, was now secondary to their needs and development. If that meant viewing Earth's creatures with less reverence than before, so be it. Evolution had presented him with its finest achievements, and his loyalty belonged to the future, not the past. 3 months had passed since Marcus discovered the alien hatchlings, and his transformation from wildlife protector to something entirely different was now complete. What had begun as scientific curiosity and protective instinct had evolved into an obsession that consumed every aspect of his existence. His research station, once a hub for conservation work, had become something resembling an alien nursery combined with a fortress designed to keep Earth's inferior creatures at bay. The changes in both Marcus and his charges were remarkable. The three beings had grown rapidly, now standing nearly 3 feet tall, with proportionally longer limbs and more pronounced cranial development. Their communication had evolved from simple chirps and musical tones to a complex language that incorporated both audible sounds and color patterns displayed through their prismatic scales. Marcus had spent countless hours learning to interpret these communications, and he was beginning to understand concepts that human language couldn't adequately express. Alpha, the largest and most assertive of the three, had developed what Marcus could only describe as psychic abilities. It could sense the approach of animals from great distances and seemed capable of influencing their behavior through some form of mental projection. Marcus had witnessed Alpha turning aggressive bears away from the station simply by focusing its attention on them. The bears would approach normally, then suddenly stop, show signs of confusion and distress, and quickly retreat back into the forest. Beta had become the group's primary inventor and engineer. Its ability to understand and manipulate complex mechanical and electronic systems was far beyond anything humans had achieved. Using only basic materials from Marcus's research station, Beta had created devices that seemed to bend the laws of physics. One contraption appeared to generate energy from ambient electromagnetic fields, while another could purify water at the molecular level through processes Marcus couldn't begin to understand. Gamma, still the most social of the three, had developed an unsettling ability to mimic not just human speech, but human emotions and mannerisms. It could perfectly replicate Marcus's voice, his gestures, even his facial expressions when it chose to alter its features slightly. More disturbing still, Gamma seemed to be reading Marcus's thoughts and emotions, responding to his feelings before he had consciously acknowledged them himself. These developments filled Marcus with pride and wonder, but they also intensified his contempt for terrestrial life. Every day brought new evidence of his charge's superiority, making the simple behaviors of Earth animals seem increasingly pathetic by comparison. When wolves howled in the distance, Marcus no longer heard the wild beauty that had once stirred his soul. Instead, he heard the meaningless vocalizations of creatures too limited to engage in real communication. His attitude toward the animals had progressed from mere indifference to active hostility. When a family of deer ventured too close to the research station, Marcus would chase them away with loud noises and thrown objects. He began setting up barriers and deterrents to keep wildlife away from what he now considered sacred ground. The presence of ordinary animals felt like contamination, a reminder of the evolutionary failures that populated Earth while true intelligence struggled to establish itself. The breaking point in Marcus's relationship with his former profession came when his supervisor, Dr. Sarah Chun, arrived for her quarterly inspection of the research station. Marcus had been dreading this visit for weeks, knowing that hiding 3 rapidly growing alien beings would be nearly impossible. However, He had underestimated both the intelligence of his charges and his own willingness to deceive. When Dr. Chin's helicopter approached the station, Alpha immediately sensed the incoming human presence and communicated the threat to its companions. Within minutes, all three beings had hidden themselves in the underground storage area that Beta had secretly expanded into a sophisticated concealment chamber. By the time Dr. Chin landed and approached the cabin, there was no visible evidence of the alien's presence. However, concealing the changes in Marcus himself proved much more difficult. Dr. Chin immediately noticed his altered appearance. He had lost weight, his eyes had developed an intensity that bordered on fanaticism, and his usually meticulous research notes had become increasingly erratic and focused on theoretical concepts rather than practical wildlife observation. During their meeting, Dr. Chin expressed concern about Marcus's isolation and suggested that he might benefit from returning to civilization for a psychological evaluation. As she spoke, describing him as if he were just another animal whose behavior needed to be monitored and controlled, Marcus felt a rage building inside him that he had never experienced before. This woman, this representative of humanity's limited understanding, was treating him like a specimen while the most advanced beings in the universe waited hidden below their feet. The conversation grew tense when Dr. Chin began questioning Marcus about unusual reports from local pilots who had observed strange lights and electromagnetic disturbances in his research area. Marcus realized that his secret was already under investigation, that it was only a matter of time before government agencies or military personnel arrived to claim his charges. That night, after Dr. Chin had departed with promises to return within a month with additional personnel, Marcus experienced his first direct psychic contact with the aliens. As he lay in bed, struggling with anxiety about the future, he suddenly felt a presence in his mind that was unmistakably non-human. The contact was gentle but overwhelming, like being embraced by an intelligence vast beyond anything he had imagined. Through this mental connection, Marcus learned that his charges had been observing and evaluating him just as intensely as he had been studying them. They had been aware of his changing attitudes toward terrestrial life, and rather than being disturbed by his growing hostility toward Earth animals, they approved of it. In their perspective, this was evidence of his evolving consciousness, his progression beyond the limitations of his birth species. The aliens communicated concepts that revolutionized Marcus's understanding of life and evolution. They revealed that they were not simply another species from another planet, but representatives of a form of existence that transcended planetary origins. They were part of what could only be described as a galactic consciousness, a network of intelligent beings who had evolved beyond the constraints of biological determinism that trapped species like humans and Earth animals. According to their telepathic communication, biological evolution as it occurred on Earth was actually a primitive and inefficient process. True evolution happened through conscious choice and mental development, allowing beings to transcend their physical limitations and genetic programming. The aliens had chosen to take physical form for specific purposes, but their essential existence was as pure consciousness that could adapt to any environment or challenge. They explained that their crash landing had not been accidental. They had detected unusual electromagnetic patterns emanating from Marcus's research area, patterns that indicated the presence of a human consciousness capable of evolutionary advancement. They had come specifically to evaluate him as a potential candidate for transcendence beyond his species' limitations. Marcus learned that his growing contempt for Earth animals was not a character flaw, but a necessary stage in his development. Just as a butterfly could not return to being a caterpillar, an evolved consciousness could not maintain emotional connections to primitive life forms. His changing perspective was evidence that he was becoming something more than human, just as his charges were more than simple aliens. The revelation filled Marcus with purpose and determination. He was no longer just protecting 3 crashed aliens. He was participating in his own evolutionary transformation. Every Earth animal that irritated him with its simple behaviors was actually helping him recognize his own growing superiority. Every moment he spent learning from his charges brought him closer to joining their transcendent form of existence. Over the following weeks, Marcus began actively implementing the aliens' teachings. He started by completely abandoning his original research work, focusing instead on documenting the aliens' knowledge and abilities. His scientific training proved invaluable in understanding their technologies and biological processes, but he had to abandon conventional scientific thinking to grasp their more advanced concepts. Under their guidance, Marcus began developing his own psychic abilities. At first, this manifested as enhanced intuition and an ability to sense animal movements from greater distances. Gradually, his perceptions expanded to include detection of electromagnetic fields, plant health status, and even geological stability. He found that he could influence animal behavior through focused concentration, much as Alpha did naturally. These developing abilities came with an unexpected side effect. Earth animals began to actively avoid him. Where once forest creatures had been comfortable around his research station, now they fled whenever Marcus appeared. Birds would stop singing when he walked through the forest. Small mammals would abandon their normal territories rather than remain near his presence. Initially, Marcus was concerned about this development, but his charges explained that this was exactly what should happen. His evolving consciousness was naturally incompatible with primitive biological awareness. Earth animals instinctively recognized that he was becoming something beyond their capacity to understand or interact with safely. This explanation provided Marcus with a framework for understanding his relationship with the natural world that he had spent his career studying and protecting. He was no longer part of Earth's biological community, but was transcending it to join a higher order of existence. The animal's avoidance of him was not rejection, but recognition of his evolutionary advancement. As his abilities continued to develop, Marcus found himself actively resenting the presence of wildlife around the research station. Their simple behaviors and biological limitations seemed increasingly offensive to him. When a black bear approached the station looking for food, Marcus didn't just chase it away. He projected feelings of terror and confusion that sent the animal fleeing in panic. The incident with the bear marked a turning point in Marcus's relationship with Earth's creatures. For the first time, he had actively used his developing abilities to harm rather than help an animal. The bear's obvious distress and confusion should have disturbed him, but instead, he felt satisfaction. Here was a creature that operated on pure instinct, incapable of growth or understanding, interfering with the work of beings who represented the pinnacle of conscious evolution. From that point forward, Marcus began to see all Earth animals as obstacles to progress rather than subjects worthy of protection. His charges encouraged this perspective, explaining that attachment to primitive life forms would limit his evolutionary potential. To become truly advanced, he needed to abandon all emotional connections to his birth planet's failed experiments in consciousness. The final test of Marcus's commitment came when Dr. Chun returned to the research station as promised, bringing with her 2 additional researchers and a representative from the Canadian Wildlife Service. Their stated purpose was to investigate the electromagnetic anomalies and conduct a psychological evaluation of Marcus, but he knew they were really there to discover his secret. As the official party approached the station, Marcus felt a calm determination rather than anxiety. His charges had prepared him for this confrontation, and he was ready to protect them at any cost. The 3 aliens remained hidden in their underground chamber, but they maintained constant psychic contact with Marcus, guiding his responses and lending him mental strength. The interview with the officials revealed how completely Marcus had changed. When questioned about his research activities, he provided technically accurate, but deliberately misleading responses. When asked about his health and mental state, he projected an aura of calm competence that convinced the Wildlife Service representative that there were no immediate concerns. However, Dr. Chin was not so easily convinced. She had worked with Marcus for several years and could sense that something fundamental had changed about him. Her questions became more probing, focusing on his emotional responses and personal connections rather than his professional responsibilities. The confrontation reached its climax when Dr. Chen directly asked Marcus about his feelings toward the wildlife he was supposed to be protecting. Without hesitation, Marcus told her the truth, that he had come to understand that most Earth animals were evolutionary dead ends, biological machines incapable of real consciousness or growth, and that his time was better spent on more advanced pursuits. The shock and horror on Dr. Chen's face confirmed what Marcus had suspected for months. Ordinary humans were almost as limited as the animals they claimed to protect. They were incapable of recognizing true evolutionary advancement when it appeared before them. Their attachment to primitive life forms prevented them from embracing the future that his charges represented. That night, as the officials prepared to leave with reports that would likely lead to Marcus's dismissal and possibly his institutionalization, he made his final commitment to his new existence. He would no longer pretend to be the person he had been before. His transformation was complete, and there could be no return to his former life as a protector of inferior species. 6 months after his initial encounter with the alien hatchlings, Marcus stood at the edge of a personal and philosophical abyss that would have been unimaginable to his former self. The research station had been transformed into something that resembled a temple more than a scientific facility, with advanced alien technologies seamlessly integrated into every system. The 3 beings he had rescued were no longer dependent children, but sophisticated entities whose abilities continued to expand in ways that challenged his understanding of what consciousness could become. Marcus himself had evolved far beyond human norms. His psychic abilities now allowed him to communicate directly with electronic devices, manipulate electromagnetic fields with his thoughts, and perceive reality across multiple dimensional layers that ordinary humans couldn't detect. His physical form had even begun to change subtly, with his eyes developing flecks of the same color-shifting properties that characterized his charge's scales, and his neural pathways reorganizing to accommodate nonlinear thinking patterns. The transformation had come with a price that Marcus was only beginning to understand. His contempt for Earth's biological systems had grown into something approaching hatred. Every sound made by native animals triggered anger responses that he had to actively suppress to maintain any pretense of sanity. The very presence of unenhanced life forms felt like contamination, a reminder of the evolutionary failures that cluttered the universe while superior beings struggled to establish themselves. This morning brought news that would force Marcus to confront the ultimate implications of his transformation. Through their psychic network, his charges informed him that their parent ship had detected the energy signatures of their continued existence and was approaching Earth. The rescue vessel would arrive within 72 hours, bringing with it advanced beings whose consciousness made even Marcus's evolved charges seem primitive by comparison. The news filled Marcus with anticipation and terror in equal measure. He would finally meet representatives of the galactic consciousness that his charges had described, beings who existed primarily as pure thought with only temporary physical manifestations. However, their arrival would also mean the end of his unique relationship with the 3 entities he had come to regard as his teachers and guides. More disturbingly, his charges revealed that the approaching ship carried beings who viewed Earth's biosphere with the same contempt that Marcus had developed for individual animals. To them, the entire planet was a failed experiment in biological evolution, populated by species too primitive to warrant preservation. Their rescue mission included protocols for cleansing contaminated environments to prevent the spread of evolutionary regression to other worlds. Marcus realized with growing horror that his transformation had been part of a larger plan. His charges had not accidentally crash-landed near his research station. They had been deliberately sent to evaluate Earth's potential for conscious evolution. His own development had been a test case to determine whether humans could transcend their biological limitations or or whether they were permanently trapped in primitive consciousness like other terrestrial species. The evaluation process had already been completed, and the results were damning. Through Marcus's own reactions and development, the aliens had concluded that while individual humans might be capable of evolutionary advancement, the species as a whole was too attached to biological existence to embrace transcendent consciousness. Worse still, humans' emotional connections to other Earth species made them unsuitable candidates for integration into the galactic network. The approaching ship carried technology capable of sterilizing Earth's biosphere in a matter of days, eliminating all life forms except those deemed worthy of preservation for research purposes. The aliens viewed this not as genocide, but as a necessary step in cosmic evolution, removing failed experiments to make room for more advanced forms of consciousness. Marcus found himself caught between his loyalty to his charges and a dawning awareness of what his transformation had cost him. The man who had once dedicated his life to protecting Earth's wildlife was now complicit in a plan that would destroy every living creature on the planet. His evolution beyond human consciousness had made him a traitor to his own species and to the natural world he had once loved. The internal conflict triggered a crisis that threatened to tear apart his reconstructed identity. Marcus began experiencing flashbacks to his pre-transformation life, memories of the wonder and joy he had once felt when observing wild animals in their natural habitats. He remembered the satisfaction of successful conservation projects, the peace he had found in the forest's natural rhythms, and the deep sense of connection he had felt to Earth's biological community. These memories clashed violently with his current reality. The same creatures that had once filled him with wonder now seemed like irritating distractions from more important concerns. The forest sounds that had once brought him peace were now cacophonous noise that interrupted his concentration. The natural processes he had spent his career studying and protecting appeared meaningless compared to the cosmic consciousness he was learning to access. The contradiction became unbearable when a young deer wandered into the research station's clearing, limping from an injury that would likely prove fatal in the harsh northern winter. Marcus's first instinct was to help the animal, drawing on decades of veterinary training and conservation experience. However, his transformed consciousness recoiled from the idea of expending energy on such a primitive creature. Standing frozen between these competing impulses, Marcus suddenly understood what his transformation had really accomplished. He had not evolved beyond human limitations. He had simply replaced one set of biological programming with another. His loyalty to the aliens was as instinctively driven as any animal's behavior patterns. His contempt for Earth life was not enlightened superiority, but a conditioned response that served his new master's purposes. The realization shattered the philosophical framework that had sustained Marcus through months of change. If his evolution was simply another form of biological programming, then his charges were not the transcendent beings they claimed to be, but sophisticated manipulators using advanced psychology to reshape human consciousness for their own purposes. This understanding triggered what Marcus would later recognize as his first independent thought in months. Instead of consulting his charges about what to do with the injured deer, he simply knelt beside the animal and began treating its wounds. The work felt natural and satisfying in a way that his alien studies never had, reconnecting him to aspects of his identity that he had thought were permanently lost. The simple act of helping a wounded animal created ripples of awareness that spread throughout Marcus's transformed consciousness. He began to question other aspects of his development, examining his new abilities and perspectives with the critical thinking skills that had made him an effective researcher. What he discovered was disturbing and enlightening in equal measure. His psychic abilities were real, but came with limitations that his charges had never mentioned. The electromagnetic manipulation that seemed so advanced was actually dependent on technology that the aliens had implanted in his nervous system without his knowledge. His enhanced perceptions were the result of chemical modifications to his brain chemistry that could be reversed or intensified at their discretion. Most importantly, his emotional responses to Earth life had been artificially induced through a combination of psychic conditioning and neurochemical manipulation. The contempt and anger he felt toward animals was not a natural result of evolutionary advancement, but a programmed response designed to eliminate his potential resistance to their planetary sterilization plans. Understanding the extent of his manipulation filled Marcus with rage, but also with a clarity he had not experienced since his initial encounter with the crashed ship. For the first time in months, he was thinking independently, making decisions based on his own values rather than alien conditioning. The sensation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Marcus realized that he had perhaps 48 hours before the arrival of the main ship would make any resistance impossible. The beings aboard that vessel possessed technology and consciousness far beyond what his charges had demonstrated. If he was going to act against their plans, it would have to be immediately and with complete commitment to outcomes he couldn't predict. His first step was to sever the psychic connections that had made him dependent on his charge's guidance. This required a level of mental discipline that pushed his enhanced consciousness to its limits, forcing him to isolate and suppress the alien influences while maintaining access to the abilities they had helped him develop. The process was agonizing, like performing surgery on his own mind, but it was essential for independent action. With his mental autonomy restored, Marcus could see his situation clearly for the first time in months. He was harboring 3 beings whose species intended to commit planetary genocide, and he possessed knowledge that could potentially prevent or delay their plans. However, any action he took would likely result in his own death, and would certainly end his access to the advanced consciousness that had become an integral part of his identity. The choice before Marcus was ultimately about identity and values. He could maintain his alliance with the aliens, preserving his enhanced abilities and transcendent consciousness while becoming complicit in the destruction of Earth's biosphere. Alternatively, he could embrace his original human identity and fight to protect the planet that had shaped him, accepting the loss of everything he had gained through his transformation. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source. As Marcus wrestled with this impossible decision, he heard the sound of wolves howling in the distant forest. 6 months earlier, that sound had annoyed and disturbed him, representing the primitive vocalizations of creatures too limited for meaningful communication. Now, listening with his restored human consciousness, he heard something entirely different. The wolf song was not meaningless noise, but a complex communication system that conveyed information about territory, pack status, and emotional states. It was not advanced by alien standards, but it was real and authentic in a way that his imposed consciousness had never been. The wolves were not trying to transcend their biological nature. They were fulfilling it completely and magnificently. Marcus realized that his contempt for Earth life had been based on false premises. The aliens had convinced him that consciousness was only valuable if it sought to transcend biological limitations, but they had never explained why such transcendence was inherently superior to biological fulfillment. A wolf was not a failed attempt at alien consciousness. It was a successful expression of its own evolutionary path. This insight led Marcus to a profound understanding of what he had lost during his transformation. In his eagerness to evolve beyond human limitations, he had abandoned the qualities that made human consciousness valuable. His capacity for emotional connection, his instinctive protective responses, and his appreciation for life in all its forms were not evolutionary failures, but achievements worth preserving. The revelation gave Marcus the strength he needed to make his choice. He would use his remaining time to document everything he had learned about alien technology and intentions, then transmit that information to authorities who might be able to mount some kind of defense. More importantly, he would spend his final hours reconnecting with the natural world he had once loved, experiencing it one last time through human eyes rather than alien consciousness. As dawn approached on what might be Earth's last day, Marcus walked into the forest surrounding his research station. The three alien beings remained in their underground chamber, unaware that their human subject had broken free from their conditioning. Around him, the northern wilderness continued its ancient rhythms. Wolves hunting, birds nesting, and countless small creatures pursuing their biological imperatives without any awareness of the cosmic threat approaching their world. For the first time in months, Marcus felt truly at peace. Whether his warnings would prove effective or his resistance would matter in the larger scheme of things was beyond his control. What mattered was that he had reclaimed his authentic identity and chosen to stand with the world that had created him rather than the beings who had promised to transcend it. The alien consciousness that had transformed him was still accessible if he chose to embrace it, offering power and knowledge beyond human imagination. But Marcus had learned that some gifts came at too high a price, and that evolution without compassion was not advancement but degradation. As the first rescue ship's lights appeared in the pre-dawn sky, Marcus Thompson stood ready to face the consequences of choosing love over transcendence, connection over evolution, and humanity over the stars.